Throughout human history, people have engaged in work that exposed them to danger, horror, or the downright disgusting. For many, such work was all that would be available. For some, it would be the way to make the best of a grim situation, whilst for others, it would be a way to indulge in one's darkest desires. Number 1. Body Snatchers. In the early 19th century, there were many developments in our understanding of science and medicine. Many of these developments were only possible through a better understanding of human anatomy. Since 1751 in the United Kingdom, the bodies of criminals were denied burial and some would be used as medical cadavers, and were used to train new doctors. But as the professions in science and medicine exploded in number, the supply of the criminal dead could not keep up with demand. Some sought to exploit the situation and took it upon themselves to dig up the recently deceased and deliver these bodies to the doctors and teachers who would not ask too many questions. The black market in the trading of corpses became commonplace, with body snatchers working in the dead of night to harvest the recently dead. The effect on such a trade developing would lead to graves being covered with mort cages, designed to keep body snatchers from stealing corpses. Such cages would be kept over a new grave until the corpse had been given enough time to decay and be of no worth to the body snatchers. The tales of the body snatchers and the drive of science would inspire Mary Shelley in the writing of her seminal work, Frankenstein. Some body snatchers, however, found it more profitable to forego digging up bodies and instead make their own corpses. William Burke and William Hare set about murdering some 16 people between 1827 and 1828, many of whom had taken up lodging with them after a night's drinking. Their victims were usually smothered to death as to prevent damage to the corpse. The bodies would then be sold to a Robert Dr. Knox, a prominent and well-respected anatomist and lecturer. Copycats soon sprang up, notably the Benthall Green Gang in London, who even murdered a 14-year-old boy in order to sell his corpse to medical science. In response to the mistreatment of the dead, the British government passed the 1832 Anatomy Act, which set into law for the first time protections for a dead body. Rather than encourage the use of body snatchers or the likes of Burke and Hare, the act shifted the focus to those who wished to donate their body to science instead. But the act also allowed surgeons to have legal access to bodies of those who had died at workhouses, hospitals and prisons that remained unclaimed for 2 days, thereby allowing for the practice of human dissections to continue. At number 2, we have the Toshers. During the 19th century, the divide between the wealthy and the poor in the United Kingdom was clear to all. In one part of a large city, the wealthy would live a life of comfort, well-fed, and well cared for by their staff. For the rest, it was a life in the slums, exposed to a myriad of diseases and struggling to make ends meet. Perhaps one of the more disturbing examples of the differences can be best seen in the work of the Toshers. Whilst the name might sound like an insult from Sean Connery, Toshers in fact would go to extreme lengths to make a living, exploiting the open sewer networks of London. They would go through the waste during the low tide, searching for valuables that had been washed away. Coins, scraps of metal, bone, rope, or anything that could have been cleaned and sold would be scavenged. They would search and sift through raw sewage, hunting for whatever they could find. The work would be done in the dark and in dangerous sewers, meaning the Toshers would be at great risk of harm. Wading through the deep sewage, the Toshers would be at risk of being swept under by a wave of foul waste. This would happen when the sluices were opened. In the labyrinth of the sewer network, there was a major risk of getting lost, succumbing to the dangers before being able to escape. Sections of the sewers could have trapped pockets of noxious gas, posing a risk of suffocation. The swarms of rats that dwelt in the sewers could lash out and deliver an infectious bite to an unwary Tosher. Often the Toshers would work in groups in order to help one another traverse the dangers, with some experience to help navigate, but still, many would die or become seriously injured. The rewards, however, were great, especially for the lower working class prepared to venture into the sewers. They could earn as much as 6 shillings a day, putting them amongst the highest earners of their time. But in 1840 it was made illegal for unauthorized persons to enter the sewers. This did not immediately end the practice, with many simply carrying on their work in the dead of night, as the waste of the upper classes was more than they could have ever earned otherwise. Number 3, we have the gong farmer. Keeping on the theme of the sewers and what ends up in them, the next job we will discuss is the gong farmer. In Tudor England there was little if any sewerage. Instead, privies and cesspits would be used to contain human waste. It was the job of the gong farmer to dig out and remove such waste. The word gong was the Old English term for both fecal matter and toilet repository, and farmer being an apt term for the man who would clear out such waste. This work was only carried out at night, with the gong farmers working sometimes up to their necks to clear out the waste. Often, small boys were employed by the gong farmers to assist with the removal of the waste. The contents of the cesspit would be dumped into carts and driven out to designated dumping sites, often out of the city. Some of the waste would end up as fertilizer. Whilst the job was far from pleasant, it was incredibly necessary. Gong farmers would earn a significant wage for their trouble, far above the average of the day. Despite this being a vital job, gong farmers were ostracized from society and forced to live with others of the same profession away from the rest of the city. As you might imagine, such a job was not without any risks. The cesspits were not often well maintained, meaning risk of injury or even death was high. There is even a known example of a gong farmer by the name of Richard the Raker who even died, drowning in a poorly maintained cesspit. A lack of ventilation meant there was a risk of asphyxiation, whilst the conditions were a perfect breeding ground for all manner of disease. With the advent of the flushing toilet and the building of proper sewers, the need for gong farmers faded, though we ought to not forget or take for granted that such a job once existed. And finally, number 4, chimney sweepers. From the 18th century, the demand for a certain type of work increased with the boom in cities. As more and more people used coal fires to heat their homes, the cities and chimneys became full of soot and ash, posing a real risk of accidental fires. And many a master chimney sweep would employ young boys to climb up the chimney to remove the soot, in a job known as climbing boys. These boys could be as young as 4 years old and would be picked up from the orphanages or workhouses. Some were even sold to a master sweep by desperate parents, or in the hopes that it could lead to a trade. The child's small stature meant they would be able to climb up into the narrow chimneys with a broom held above their head and remove the soot and ash. The climb would be difficult, with the child pressing their elbows and knees against the walls of the chimney, resulting in many a callus or cut. It was also not unheard of for the master sweepers to encourage the boys to move faster, prodding them with poles, or sending up other children to use pins to prick the feet of the first child, or even lighting a fire underneath. The boys would not be paid for their work, instead given food and lodging by their master. Even then, the child would sometimes be kept malnourished as to keep them as small as possible. As you might imagine, this job was very dangerous. There are accounts of young boys becoming stuck in the chimney, held in place by the shape of the flue and compressed soot. Death by suffocation was a real possibility, as was falling or getting caught in a fire caused by the soot. The general health of the climbing boy was poor, due to the neglectful treatment of their masters, exposure to the soot and ash, and due to working in all weathers. The child's bones would grow deformed due to their near constant positions in the chimney. They would even have a high risk of losing their eyesight due to the soot and ash getting into their eyes. Often the children would be made to work naked, further increasing the risk of injury and exposure to the harmful soot. But, perhaps worst of all, was chimney sweep's carcinoma. This cancer would tend to develop in the patient's late 30s, though there are reports of cases in children as young as 8 years old. It was a form of scrotal cancer that was the first of many occupational cancers to be identified amongst people working in dangerous jobs. Whilst the practice of using children as chimney sweeps was somewhat barred by the Chimney Sweeps Act of 1788 imposing a minimum age of 8, it was not a law that was followed. Even though further acts increased the age to 16, it would not be until 1875 that the age of chimney sweepers was set to a minimum age of 21 years old, but this law was actually enforced. The notion of children being sent up chimneys certainly is a disturbing image, speaking of a time well before proper work safety or child labour laws were enforced. It speaks of using children as tools, irrespective of the dangers or harm. These are but a handful of jobs that people have undertaken throughout history that we might think are disturbing today, but through our technological advancements, many jobs have thankfully become obsolete. Though we must not forget that disturbing and dangerous jobs still exist to this day, jobs that are vital and are either overlooked or underappreciated. Perhaps one day we will look back at jobs today in dismay, disturbed that they were ever done by people.